Tililalam Amaoyomoy Amamoyomom. Good afternoon, my friends. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome aboard. Welcome aboard. Hamoyo yidi hamoyo. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining today. Afterlife. What in heaven does that really mean? And perhaps, even more importantly, why is that relevant? I mean, practically speaking, this is a class about living with certainty. Right here in this terrestrial world. You don't need Bitachon when you get to the other world. The presence of God is abundantly obvious when we get there. Why is this even a discussion? It's not like we're talking about getting to the afterlife. It's about not only believing, but also trusting in the hereafter. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge very gratefully that today's generous sponsorship by a dear friend and member of our community, Michelle Kahn, who sponsors today's class, Afterlife, in loving memory, and, in her words, to celebrate the lives of her beloved mother on her yahrzeit. Today, of course, is Rosh Chodesh Shvat. Her mother's yahrzeit is Yud Shvat. Her name was Etel, the daughter of Harav Avraham Mendel, Zechernu Livracha, and Michelle also dedicates his class to the memory of her recently departed brother, Michael Kalman Ben Tzvi Mordechai Zechernu Livracha. He was niftar on Rosh Chodesh Iyar, and that marks 9 months today to his passing, as this is Rosh Chodesh Shvat. May their neshamas have an aliyah in the afterlife, and may our discussion about and our learning about why it's important for us to have not only emunah, but also bitachon in the reality of the afterlife necessarily can and will make a world of difference in our here and now existence. Thank you, Michelle. So I want to begin with just taking a moment to speak about the greatness of Rabbeinu Bachaya. You know, we spend literally endless amounts of time poring over every single word penned by the great Rabbeinu Shlomo Yitzchaki Rashi. And we should. And the greatest minds have spent their entire lifetimes devoted to understanding the profundity and the depth that is to be found in the words of Maimonides, Rambam, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon Asfardi. You know, it is said that the great Rav Chaim of Brisk, Rav Chaim Halevi, one of the greatest geniuses of the last few hundred years, spent his whole life analyzing Rambam, the precise nuances of Rambam. I once heard, and I never was able to corroborate this as a fact, but that the Rogatchover Goren, probably the greatest mind of the 20th century, or the first half of the 20th century, he used to go to sleep at night. He would say, a gute Nacht Rebbe, good night Rebbe, referring to the Rambam. And these Torah luminaries, these prodigies, spent their lives poring over every single nuance that's found in the words of the Rambam. We have dozens of commentaries that were written on Rashi, trying to understand the slightest detail down to our very time. The Rebbe devoted hundreds of hours, public teaching of Rashi, on the hairline, on the nuance. If Rashi changed or omitted or slightly tweaked something, it was a world of ideas and ideals, an enormous amount of profundity and depth contained within it. My dear friends, Rashi is born just 10 years prior to Rabbeinu Bachaya I. The Rambam isn't born until nearly 80 years after Rabbeinu Bachaya I. Rabbeinu Bachaya ben Yosef ibn Pekuda is the acknowledged master on what his book is called, Chovat HaLevavot. When it comes to our emotional devotion to God, everything from trust to faith, from love to awe, from passion to exuberance, Rabbeinu Bachaya is the master. His magnum opus, Chovos HaLevavos, and specifically the portion of his book, the segment that's dedicated to Bitachon, has continued to remain the gold standard. There are half a dozen major Rishonim who wrote treatises on Emunah and Bitachon. People like Nachmanides, Ramban, Rabbeinu Yonah, people like Rabbeinu Bachaya II. Everything always goes back to Rabbeinu Bachaya. And yet, he wrote a book that's very difficult to understand. It's difficult to understand sometimes, not because it seems difficult, but because it seems so overly simple. To be sure, there are about a dozen commentaries that were written, authored over the years, on the Chovos HaLevavos, and specifically the Sha'ar Bitachon. Our Rebbe himself devoted many hours to clarifying fine points of the Sha'ar Bitachon's thesis. So it bothers me so much that when it comes to 2 sentences, that's all we're going to learn today. I'm telling you before we begin, just 2 sentences of the Sha'ar Bitachon. I couldn't find pshat. Never mind the recent English translations that just gloss over this. Don't explain anything. Even the commentaries that were written before, it's like, it drove me crazy. I couldn't understand this. And there was very little help. So I had to really break my head. And before I begin, let me say this. I don't know if this is the pshat, if this is the true meaning or the true intention of the great Rabbeinu Bachaya. I don't know. I don't know. Having said that, what I'm going to share with you today is not my own silly ideas. I'm going to introduce you to some of the profoundest spiritual ideas that have been developed over the last few centuries, specifically in the corpus, the writings of Hasidus Chabad. Very deep stuff. Whether this is the Pshat in Rabbeinu Bachaya, I can't tell you with certainty. But this I can tell you, what I'm sharing with you, is true Torah. And I think, I'm just a little guy, but I think that this is the Pshat, or it is a Pshat, in the words of Rabbeinu Bachaya. We have multiple ways of understanding Rashi, multiple ways of understanding Rambam, and so many other great Rishonim. Perhaps somebody else has a different way of understanding these words, but this is the conclusion that I've come to after many, many, many hours of brain-racking efforts. And the last nuance I want to add is that I based my thesis, my understanding of Rabbeinu Bachaya, on the words of the most enigmatic of commentaries written on the Shaar HaBitachon, the Neder Bakodesh. I talked about him in the previous episode. I can't seem to find anything about him. I just know that his name was Rebbe Moshe. He was the son of a Rebbe Reuven, and he was a Rav, or a Magid, in Yorbarg. And I could find the town on Google, but there's nothing Jewish left there. And what we know is that he wrote a commentary which is based on and is a synergy of drush and sod. In the vernacular, homily and Kabbalah. It's astounding to me that it was only published once. Only published once. I mentioned this in the previous episode. Just once in 1790, and only recently has seen the light of print again. So what I'm going to tell you today, at least my supposition that this is the words of Rabbeinu Bachaya, are based on the Neder Bakodesh's commentary, because the Neder Bakodesh throws a number of verses at us, which I can't find any other way to understand, if not from the prism of Kabbalah, Lurianic teaching, and especially as it's been amplified and elucidated with terrestrial. So, with those little prefaces, any questions here? Okay, Chodesh Tov, everybody. Those who are bothering us, please go bother somebody else. Okay, on to the study now. So, if you're following along in the recently released Kihat version, we're on page 111. I have to tell you, I don't think it's going to help you very much, but it's a good place to start. So, the fourth chapter, the longest, most exhaustive chapter of this entire work, opens by identifying different ideas or matters in which we are obligated to place our trust in Hashem. Now, it's extremely important to have clarity as to the different ways or circumstances and situations in which we have to apply our Bitachon. Why? Very simply, there's a tension between trust and our efforts. There's a tension. And the tension is, if I'm not doing this anyway, if God's making everything happen, why do I have to work so hard? If Hashem blesses me, in everything I do, so I did something, I'll make an investment. Yeah, but you didn't make multiple investments. You didn't play the market. What do I have to do that for? What do you mean? If you want to make an investment, you have to invest in a wide array of things. So if some of the stocks will go south, some of the others might go north. You have to diversify. The person says, I don't have to diversify. Anyway, it's in the hands of Hashem. Whatever God decides goes up, what goes down, and no amount of my strategy or acumen is going to make a difference. So what do I have to make any differences for? What do I have to spend time thinking about this? Why do I have to get up at 4 a.m. and look at the Hang Seng and see how the markets are reacting in the Far East, and then look at how the markets open here, and then make my decisions? Whatever. It's like I make a decision, I invest in something, and if Hashem wants, that's where He's giving me my parnasa from, right? Wrong. Really? Why? Because Hashem says you have to make the right efforts, the hishtadlus. In a recent class that I delivered right here on this channel on the Gemara in Masechet Megillah, and you should go back and watch it. It's called Dining with the Devil. We really concluded with a powerful Bitachon lesson. How Esther, it turns out, has multiple reasons for strangely inviting Haman to dinner, but she had a strategy. And there was all kinds of bases she was covering. And of course, we know that everything works out. But interestingly, despite the fact that she had all of these things in mind, not a single one of them worked the way she thought they would. It's like a person who diversifies, invests in 16 different fields, the energy sector and the mining sector, the gambling sector and the medicine or pharmaceutical sector, all the sectors. And there was one sector they didn't invest in, but somebody gave them a gift of a stock. And that area, the sector they didn't invest in, that's the one that went through the roof. That's basically sums up the story of Esther, because all of her strategy, brilliant as it was, none of it came to fruition. Not for any fault of her own, because Hashem decided to make a miracle that night. And the Persian king couldn't sleep. Nodadashnas HaMelech. Maharil, the great halachic expert of the world of Ashkenaz, really the foundation of the Ramah and the Shulchan Aruch as we know it, in the Ashkenaz world, he says, now raise your voice. When you get to this verse, Alaylahu, raise your voice. Tokveshalnes, based on the words of the Gemara. The Gemara says this is where the miracles start to happen. Up until now is, nature taking its course. Now the miracles are expressing themselves in the fullest way, not with seas that split open or fire and ice that rain from the heavens, but with a king who can't sleep. So Esther makes the calculations. The calculations happen not to work, but that doesn't mean she did the wrong thing. And this is hard for people. It's hard for them to wrap their heads around. At what point do I stand down and say, you know what, this is in Hashem's hands? I can't do anything else. And at what point do I say, hey, you have no right to bow out. You need to still make more effort. The Mittler Rebbe, in his preface to Pekach Ivrim, I think that's where it is, he says that if a person invests himself too much in material pursuit, so he's so busy doing business that he doesn't come to Shul to daven and he doesn't learn Torah, or Chas v'Shalom isn't careful about Shabbat because he's making money, then he's in danger of losing his wealth. Why? Because these things are just what we call kelim, vehicles or conventions. It's like an envelope for the blessing that comes from God. It's like a garment. And he says if garments are too big, you can't move in them. He says you have to make sure your garments fit. Garments that fit are helpful. Too much involvement in business and material pursuit, it's like garments that are too big. So the Rebbe writes to somebody in a letter that just as garments can be too big, you could also have garments that are too small, too skimpy. You don't show up at a wedding in swimwear attire. It's not appropriate. You need to be a little more dressed, covering the subject. The point? Simple. You can't under-engage. You can't under-invest either. So how do I know where that line is? It's good you asked. Rabbeinu Bachaya is going to answer that question, dimension by dimension, because each situation has a different need for Bitachon's application, insofar as my hishtadlos, my efforts are concerned, and the amount of trust I put on Hashem. That's all fine. I essentially recapped what we've learned up until this point. So this could be in material pursuit. It could be in the performance of a mitzvah, a bridge to eternity. Even a mitzvah. I can only do my part. I can't guarantee or assume that it's going to be successful. I can do my best. And we've learned previously that you actually have positive consequences from the mitzvah, not for the action, but rather for the efforts that you made. And here Rabbeinu Bachaya, having spoken about the involvement in a whole array of things, from interpersonal relationship, from working on your marriage, from engaging with your children, for providing for your loved ones, health and wellness, a whole array of things, and the mitzvahs we have to do, which involve ourselves, or mitzvahs that involve other, sometimes passive participants or recipients of our largesse. Then Rabbeinu Bachaya goes back to what we started already earlier, and he says, and then there's the inyan elam haba. You have to trust in eternity. Why do I need to trust in eternity? To my deep frustration, nobody said anything except the Neder B'Kodesh. The Neder B'Kodesh, in the beginning of Perek Revi, when we divided the category broadly into two categories, we said in Yonei Elam Hazeh, things about this world, and in Yonei Elam Haba, the Neder B'Kodesh at the time said, he invoked the verse, Chelki Hashem Amra Nafshi, and several episodes ago, I devoted myself to trying to understand the meaning of Olam Haba, the world to come, and the notion or idea of misguided trust. Where would trust come in? Why is trust necessary? Now, in that episode was only mentioned. There's another verse that the Neder B'Kodesh quotes, which I didn't get a chance to get to at all, which is good, because I'm going to spend time in it today. And the other verse is, La yidach mimenu nidach, which means somebody who is banished will never be entirely banished. That's what he says. What that has to do with eternity, it's not really clear. I'll remind you that the Neder B'Kodesh said that Iker HaBitachon. We talked about this. Your primary need for trust is not in business, not in relationship, not in medicinal or health pursuits. No. Your primary issue of trust is eternity. What does that mean? Let's remember that we're not talking about emunah, we're not talking about belief now, we're talking about trust. And the difference, as we've copiously illustrated and explained time and again in previous episodes, is that out of emunah, a person may not be moved to do the right thing. The most famous example of this is the thief, who the Gemara, the Talmud tells us, the sages said, may well be crying out to God to help him, believing that God could give him success as he makes his or her heist. But if you believe that God can make miracles and that God cares about you, is engaged, and you're in the foxhole, so you're crying out, then why wouldn't you just rely on Hashem to provide for you without stealing? Why wouldn't you say, do something, and God, the same God who can save you from getting caught, the same God can save you from making a bad investment and make a living, do something honest. It's not a question. Well, it's not a contradiction, I should say. Person says, yes, I believe it, but that's as far as I believe it. Emunah is a funny kind of thing. It's a strange conviction. I mean, who are we fooling? I'm pretty certain all of you believe in Hashem. You're still with me. I'm like, what? Almost a half hour into this, or 25 minutes into this? You're still watching? You better believe in Hashem. Like, why would you be interested in listening otherwise? I know I believe in Hashem. And yet, we do some silly things. Inappropriate things. But if you believe in God, so why do you do those inappropriate things? You believe, don't you? Well, yes, but there's a Yetzer Hara, and there's life, and somebody stepped on my toes, and somebody promised me A, B, and C, and I was excited to get X, Y, and Z. Life happens. Stuff gets in the way. So emunah has to be translated into bitachon, which this is possibly the meaning of the idea which is talked about in Chassidus, that the emunah has to be nizun, it has to be nurtured, it has to be nourished, it has to be developed, and it becomes bitachon. And as we talked about in the previous episode, this is like the fruit. The tree has to be curated, taken care of, fed, nurtured, and then it produces the fruit. The fruit is Bitachon. The fruit is Bitachon is how we live our lives. So why do I have to have Bitachon in the world to come? I need Bitachon in this world. I'm going out to work, and I'm filled with anxiety. I don't know if I'll succeed. I borrowed a lot of money. I'm investing it. If I lose this, not only do I not have my loved ones, I'm going to be in debt. I'm going to be owing all this money I borrowed. I'm very anxious. So comes David HaMelech and says, B'tach b'Hashem, what are you doing? Where's your trust? And Rabbeinu Bachaya explains that this means that you're not anxious. You're not worried. You're not concerned. Why not? Because I rely on God. I put all my trust in Hashem. As we've talked about at great length previously. So, in Yonei Elam Haba, I need to trust. How does that change my life today? I mean, clearly, Rabbeinu Bachaya has to believe that it changes my life today. I'm asking the question, how? I can't tell you how much it frustrates me that nobody explains this. It bothers me terribly. I thought maybe the art scroll would say something. Nothing. Literally nothing. There's nothing here. All they do in a footnote is tell you that there's two categories of Olam Haba. Olam Haba matters do not have subcategories. Yeah, thank you very much. That's really helpful. I mean, I could kind of notice that when it came to Chelik Aleph, the first part, Achad Mehem, which is Olam Haza, that it broke down into no less than 5 different levels, 5 different dimensions. All right, very nice. Olam Haba, he says, pardon me, we had previously 3 which were only materially oriented, 2 which were bridges to eternity or mitzvah-oriented things we do in this world. Okay, there's a level of trust, what I leave in Hashem's hands, what I do. But then he goes on to say, what about the matters of the world to come? He says this you have to divide in 2. You have to know where to place your trust. It's not the same trust you place in one dimension of the world to come as in the other dimension of the world to come. What? What does that mean? What does it mean that Olam Haba is Yichok l'shnei chalakim? That I have to divide Olam Haba into 2 categories? He says, well, Olam Haba has 2 categories. The classification of matters of world to come is that one is Echad Mehem Hagmul Haroi, that one category of eternity or the world to come is the reward that's commensurate with the efforts that a person made in this world. And the second is Shuhu Michesed HaBeiri Yisala, that the second is that it's bestowed upon Hashem ala Chasidim v'haneviyim lo'olam haba, for Chasidim and for prophets. I don't know if I'm the Chassid of Rabbeinu Bachaya. I try to be a Chassid. I'm definitely not a prophet. What am I even learning this for? If this second level of Sha'ar, which is not measured strictly in accordance with the level of mitzvahs that one did, but rather it is beyond what a person did, and it's only applicable for who Rabbeinu Bachaya called 1,000 years ago a chassid, or a navi, a prophet, what does that have to do with me? This book isn't written for Chasidim and Nevi'im. This book is written for everybody. The argument could be made that it's written in abundantly simple language in Arabic. Why? Because most Jews were not Chasidim and Nevi'im. That's why. They weren't super pious or learned. And they certainly weren't prophets. This was written for people who couldn't even read Hebrew. So in case you think that I'm talking to you about things which are way beyond what you could possibly imagine or hope to understand, think again. Rabbeinu Bachaya wrote this for everybody. Evidenced by the fact that he wrote it in a language that everybody could speak. So why in heaven is he telling me I have to trust that there's reward? But if I believe there's reward, it's not good enough? I understand how Bitachon, when it comes to medicine, for example, makes a world of difference. I understand. People place their trust in medical professionals. It's a big mistake. The greatest medical professional can make a mistake. So you're mistaken by placing your trust in him. Who should you place your trust in? In HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Place your trust in God. Not in the surgeon. Not in the oncologist. In Hashem. Well, in that case, why should I look for a big doctor, a specialist, a person who does this all the time? As long as somebody is a doctor, so that it'll be Hashem's convention. The answer is that there's an amount of hishtadlut, our part, the role we need to play. Then there's the role that Hashem plays. He'll choose to do what he chooses to do. That doesn't exonerate you from doing the best you could do, or me, or any of us. We need Bitachon there. In fact, it's a fraught endeavor. So many of us fail daily, hourly, when it comes to our businesses, thinking that it's our efforts, our hard work, our acumen, our strategy, our talent that brought us the profit. But it's not so. Because sometimes, with all of the aforementioned, we fail. So I wonder how that happened. It wasn't my fault. That was somebody else's fault. I did all the right things. Somebody else ruined it. Circumstances beyond my control. That's always going to be the case. Oh, it's Murphy's Law. Who's Murphy? What does that even mean? Everything that happens me'es HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Well, in that case, why am I knocking myself out? I want to work from 9 to 5. I should work from 9 to 9:15 and then go to do whatever I want. Go back to learn Torah all day. I worked for 15 minutes. I did my part. Now Hashem will make miracles happen. Is it possible that a few clicks on the computer in a span of 15 minutes could yield me profit that will carry me through the month? Not only it's possible, it happens all the time. People spend days and days, weeks, months working on something, and the thing that took 15 minutes, that's where the profit came from. And all the months went nowhere. So why don't I just reach out to one little thing and check, and that's all? That's not the way it works. There's a beautiful story that I once heard in the name of the chief of the Rebbe's secretariat, Rabbi Chodakov, who was really the Rebbe's general, so to speak, in the army of Shlichus. And all of the original Shluchim were trained under his tutelage and given continuous direction from him. So a certain Shliach in the early years, this is like in the late 50s, maybe in the mid-early 60s, Rabbi Chodakov has a conversation with him, and he says, what's happening? And he says to him, well, it was like very demoralizing. You made this whole event, and one person came. So Rabbi Chodakov said, so what'd you do? What did I do? One person show up for an event, he says, I canceled. So Rabbi Chodakov said, what's wrong with you? You make an event, you advertise, and you promote, and 100 people show up. Of the 100 people who show up for your event, 10 people you actually maintain some kind of connection with, some kind of relationship that stimulates. Let's say 100 new people came in. If you get 10, you're doing very well. 10% is a very good return. Of those 10 people, maybe 5 people will really stay on, so to speak, and be interested in learning more and doing more and changing their lives. And of those 5, maybe one person will really transform himself entirely, which is what it's all about. Transformation. Transform ourselves, transform others. Transformation for the better. So Rabbi Chodakov said to him, here Hashem sent you that one person without having to go through 99, and you sent him away. Now, does that mean we should make events for one person? And the one person who shows up, that must be the one. That's ridiculous. Of course not. We're required to make the event for 100 or 1,000 people. We're trying to reach out. We're trying to share Yiddishkeit. How will it be successful? Who will be inspired? None of us know. It's true in every iota of the field of shlichut. Trying to positively impact the lives of others and change the horizon, the Jewish horizon in the future. It's always like that. If it happens to be that you put all the effort in and one person came, maybe that's the one person. But you need to make all the effort. That all works in the terrestrial reality. When it comes to heaven, I have to divide this? I have to have 2 categories? I mean, the Art Scroll commentary is like, the two categories of Olam Haba do not have subcategories. Gee, I wonder why. What do I do without the experts? It doesn't have subcategories. How do you want to subcategorize it? And what is that even supposed to mean? Why does it need to be discussed altogether? Why do I have to have trust that Hashem will give Sha'ar which is commensurate and Sha'ar which is transcendent? Sha'ar which measures itself in accordance with my mitzvahs and reward which is entirely beyond that. I don't even know what eternity has to do with the book of Bitachon. The book of Bitachon is a book of how to live my life now, here, today. What tell me eternity for? I have to trust that God will give me eternity. I have to think about Olam Haba all the time. Rabbeinu Bachaya himself, towards the end of the chapter, is going to talk about the Mishnah that says, Al tiyu ka'avodim ha'mishamshem esharav amanas l'kabel pras. Don't be like servants who are looking for a payback. Instead, you should be like somebody who serves out of love. That's what we talked about in the previous episode. Somebody gets married and he says to the man or woman he's going to marry, what are you going to do for me? I marry you because you do something for me. Really? I thought you get married because you love somebody. I want to spend the rest of my life with you because you're a good cook. I want to spend the rest of my life with you because you're a good breadwinner. What does that mean? It's like a terrible joke. They say that this fellow, his father left him $10 million, and this amazingly beautiful woman is running after him and wants to get married to him. And he says, just thinking, is the only reason that you're so interested in pursuing me, is it only because my father left me $10 million? Is that the only reason that you seem to be interested in marrying me? And she says, honey, I would marry you regardless of who left you the $10 million. Thank you very much. That's like a depiction of the lowest possible thing a person could do. Certainly in today's enlightened Western mind, to get married for money, to get married for utilitarian purposes, it's about a relationship. It's about spending your life with the person you love, as we illustrated in great detail just in the previous lecture, in the previous episode. So now we have to be trusting about this reward. And you have to know there's different levels of reward. You have to trust, God can do this. He's a very rich God. He can give you reward that's commensurate, and he can also, if you happen to be a prophet. So, it's really important. If you happen to be a prophet, you're probably very worried about reward, because Hasidim and Nevi'im only do what they do for utilitarian purposes, for payback. And they're only Hasidim and Nevi'im because they're not only going to get rewarded commensurate to their efforts. No, they're going to get rewarded way beyond. That's why they do it. That's why they're good Yidden. That's why Hashem chose them to be prophets, because they're awaiting their reward like a little dog with its panting. No, wait, is my reward here yet? No, patience. Keep jumping through hoops. It's going to be a fantastic reward when it's all over. So we're like a circus animal who's going to turn himself into a pretzel because he's getting a reward. What? My head is exploding. I mean, the Gat edition is mum, 0. 0 is nothing. He writes, reward in the world to come is given for a person's good deeds in this world. All right? But there are also special individuals who, as a result of a strong devotion to Hashem, are rewarded in a manner which is not commensurate with the deeds. This reward comes from God's kindness. Wow. And I should trust in that, right? And I should be thinking about it all day. Really? Seriously? At least here in the Gat edition, they talk about, special individuals. Here, I took a look in the Art Scroll, and he puts over there, he says, because these tzaddikim develop intense love for Hashem during the lifetimes. First of all, it doesn't say anything about tzaddikim. It says Hasidim and Nevi'im. I don't know why it's that we have to go away from the verbiage that Rabbeinu Bachaya's work shows up in. Even if Rabbi Yehuda ibn Tibbon translated as such, but like, why do you have to put a new word in? I just don't know what that means even. But now he made them into tzaddikim. So they have an intense love for Hashem, and they devote themselves to service on a level that's beyond personal obligations. He responds in kind by lovingly rewarded them beyond the measure of their deeds. It sounds to me like that is the measure of the deeds. A tzaddik has Bitachon that Hashem will show reciprocal love in Elam Haba. I don't know what to make of this. So this is where I was last night. I was so distraught. I have to think about it this way, think about it that way. And the only commentary, again, is this mystery Rebbe Moshe, the Neder B'Kodesh. So he says like this. He says, Hagmul haroi. What does it mean, the appropriate reward, the commensurate reward? He means to say, Poyal Odom, Yishalem Leikefi Maisav. A person's efforts will get remunerated in accordance with whatever he did. Lefi Maisav Sha'asa Beilam Hazeh. V'loi mitzarach chesed. God's not going to give you anything for free. You punch a card. You'll be rewarded as per your efforts. Is there anything else? What's so profound about that? So at the end, what we're going to learn, he's going to go through now 7 steps to heaven, so to speak. That's the next episode. When he calls it Derech HaChesed, so the Neder B'Kodesh says, what does it mean, Derech HaChesed? Yoiser mimifalei, more than what you accomplished. More than what you accomplished. And this is to be understood in the image of a verse that shows up in the book of Isaiah, Yeshayahu. That Yeshayahu Hanavi says, in the 64th chapter, in the 3rd verse, Ayin loirasa, no eye has seen this. You can't even imagine how fantastic this is. Elikim zulascha. Only God knows what this is. Yasel machakale. For the one who hopes and yearns, he's going to get it. What does this mean? So Rashi quotes the Gemara that's found in Masechet Shabbat on page 63. Kol hanavim kulei nisnavu eli meisa Mashiach. All the Nevi'im, all the prophets described in lurid details what life will be like when Mashiach comes. Aval olam haba, but the world that comes after olam haba, ayin leirasa. This no eye can see. Mashmoi, what does that mean, no eye? Rashi says, Shum, Mashmoi ein shum navi. No prophet can see this. Asher yasa HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'machakale, that God will do to the one who yearns, who hopes in Him. Zulasi eincha ato lekim, just you, God. Zulascha, so the Sion says, mibaladcha, only you. L'machake, to hope, tikva, he says. It's tikva, hoping. Nobody sees this. This is going to be something to the one who's machaka umamin, the one who awaits, the one who believes. Doesn't say nothing about Bitachon. Nothing about Bitachon. The Yalkut Shimoni says that all of the consolation, all the comfort, that's when Mashiach comes. But then, this is something that's beyond that. It's beyond that. The Gemara in Brachas tells us, there's Gan, and then there's Eden. This is Eden. Nor Yetzim Eden. Then Eden already we got, but Lahashkas are gone. Gan L'chud, Eden L'chud, the Gemara gives an An L'chud. And the Mefarshim basically say it's talking about the future reality of Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection. So I'm like, what is going on over here? How did the Neder B'Kodesh understand the business of God's chesed, of God's kindness, that's applicable only for Hasidim and for Nevi'im, only for the pious, and only for the prophets? He said that's the verse that talks about the resurrection, Olam Haba, the real Olam Haba. Yeah, but the real Olam Haba goes to everybody, not just to tzaddikim and Hasidim. I'm getting more confused as we move on here. The Mishnah says, Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelik le'olam haba. Most of the Mefarshim explain this Mishnah that it's talking, Olam Haba is talking about the world of resurrection, the world of Tchiyat HaMeitim, the world when bodies will be re-inhabited by their souls. And that's a reward that's going to be over the top. And nobody's ever seen it, and it's applicable for everybody. And the Neder Bachaya says, that verse that talks about the whole Jewish people, Tchiyat HaMeitim, that's for Chasidim and Nevi'im. Oh my gosh, what is going on over here? I told you before, it rankles me. It drives me crazy that, how do you publish a book on Rabbeinu Bachaya? How do you just ignore this? How do you just gloss over it? How can we continue, just move on and not bother understanding this? What is he telling us? To this point. And if it's not relevant, he wouldn't say it. And if we just ignore it and move on, we're going to miss his point. And if he misses his point, then we're going to know, how come it didn't work? Because you didn't read my book, he'll say. So we got a problem. We got to figure this out. All right, so I only have 2 clues to work with now. Okay, let's go through this together. I only have 2 clues to work with. Clue number 1 I have is the fact that Neder Bachaya seem to understand that this is connected to the verse Lo Yidach Mimeno Nidach, which means that none who is banished will be eternally banished. All right, that's a clue to go on. I have to find how that verse is explained. And then the next clue we have is the fact that somehow the Neder Bachaya sees the second level as epitomized by Isaiah's prophecy. No eye has seen this. Namely, the Olam Haba, the future world in the post-Mashiach era known as the era of resurrection. That's the only 2 clues that I had to work with. All right, I'm a sourcey guy. Okay, let's go back to the sources. Okay. So what does this pasuk, L'yidach mimeno nidach, what does it say? What's the pasuk about? So it's an awful story about the family of David HaMelech. This is documented in the book of Shmuel Beis, 2nd book of Samuel. And in the pasuk, the psukim, the narrative is about the enmity between 2 brothers, 2 sons of King David. One's name is Avshalom, and the other's name is Amnon. So what happened there? It's a pretty sick story. It's a pretty sick story. So if you take a look in the book of Shmuel Beis, and you go into chapter 13, you hear a terrible story. Terrible story. Maybe even timely. So Amnon lusts his sister, half-sister. He feigns sickness. She should come take care of him. And he rapes her. He rapes her brutally. A real, story of sexual abuse. A terrible, terrible story. Rapes her, and then he hates her afterwards. And this girl is shattered. She's shattered. Her brother picks up on what happened with the half-brother. His sister was raped. And he is furious. To add insult to injury, the king becomes aware. He's very upset, deeply grieved, but he doesn't do anything. He doesn't get involved. Avshalom nurses a grudge and a hatred against this prince, Amnon, his half-brother. So Avshalom is not going to take this lying down. He's going to avenge his sister. Arranges a feast. So those days they have these feasts. And they're going to do the shearing of the sheep. He invites the king. The king's not coming. He says, I want you to send the crown prince. You send Amnon. You send Amnon. He'll represent the king. And David HaMelech is not sure it's a good idea because he knows that these two brothers don't speak and they hate each other. But in the end, Avshalom is very convincing, and he sends him. And Avshalom instructs his guys. He says, make sure he drinks a lot. You're going to kill him. Just be a man and do what you got to do. You're not going to be guilty. I gave you the orders. And they listen. And Amnon was killed. And David HaMelech hears about it. And David HaMelech is very, very, very distraught. And he falls like away from his son. They're now their relationship is very bad. So they're not talking. Now, David HaMelech has a chief of staff and a relative. His name is Yoav. And Yoav knows that David is very distraught over the destroyed relationship, that he's lost the relationship with Avshalom. And Yoav was the commander. He loves David HaMelech. He's very loyal to King David. He sees David is suffering on account of his detachment from Avshalom. So he decides to take matters into his own hand and try to fix or remedy the situation. Avshalom is a very prominent fellow, by the way, and he has all these great aspirations. So unfortunately, Avshalom himself wants to be king at some point. It's a problem. At any rate, what Yoav does is he goes to the town of Tekoa, because there was very wise, very capable women there, and he basically hires an actress, and he gives her lines. He says, you're going to play the role of a woman who's mourning for her husband, who only has 2 sons. The sons got into a terrible fight. One son killed the other, and now my family wants to kill the murderer. And then I'll have nothing left in this world. He says, you dress in black, no cosmetics, you look distraught. And this woman is very, very, very intelligent. We actually talked about this in an episode on Hanukkah, Tekoa, olive oil, wisdom. Anyway, she's very adept. She has her lines, but she also knows how to think on her feet. And she delivers an Emmy performance, whatever they call it, those Hollywood awards, an Oscar. She would get an Oscar. And she says to the king, like, what am I going to do here? And she gets the king to say, yes, it would be the law, but I understand your circumstances. I will protect that son. So you won't be entirely bereft. And she says, like, how do I know? And she coaxes David and gets him to, and she never actually says, hey, I was just put up to this. But she does say, well, if the king believes that, then maybe the king should, do that in his own life. Because he also has a son who did something inappropriate. But he spurns him. He banished him. And David HaMelech is like, okay, who put you up to this? Who put you up? Tell me the truth. Where are you coming from? And she acknowledges it's from Yoav. And the king is actually grateful because he has this whole narrative played out before him where he becomes the one to suggest exactly the path that he refused to think about before. Because you always have clarity with regard to somebody else. You can't see things that affects you in a personal way. So part of this woman's argument, she says to David HaMelech, in the end we all die, she says. Ki meis nomos. In the end, everybody's going to die. It's like water under the bridge. It's going to be like the water that's spilled on the ground. You can't gather up the water once it gets absorbed into the ground. Shalei yasfu. V'lo yisa elikim nefesh v'choshav machshavos. God didn't just like harvest the soul without devising the thought that lo yidach lebilti yidach meno nidach, like it's not lost forever. Like life to us is like it's over, but for God there's eternity, and the soul gets gathered up. So there's a certain eternity of the soul that's alluded to in these words. Most of the Mefarshim say it's not talking about that. Most of the Mefarshim understand this, that God doesn't kill a sinner, so the sinner shouldn't be entirely lost. In the way the Metzudas David puts it, even Rashi says, "Lo yisa likim nefesh." Hashem doesn't take a person from death. Lefichach v'chashav hamelech machshavos lebilti mimeno nidach. Maybe he shouldn't banish the banished one, because anyway, in the end, life and death is in God's hands, and that was clearly God abandoned him, so to speak, to that fate. See what Rashi's saying. Take a look in the Metzudas. She was remonstrating on behalf of Avshalom, says the Metzudas. She said, Kulanu meisnamas, we'll all die in the end. We'll all die in the end. So, what's the difference if somebody died a little sooner, a little later? In the end, we'll all end up in the same place. So what's the point of killing the murderer? In Cain, ein lo hamasad etzeach. Oh, but the Torah says a murderer is guilty. Well, but in this situation, he's actually not guilty. Well, in her made-up story, there was no warning, there was no witnesses, there was no due process. They wanted to carry out a vigilante execution. But in Avshalom's situation, he didn't do it. He hired a hitman. So a taking of a soul is like water that's in the earth. As Metzudas David puts it, if it's a question of theft, of taking somebody's valuables, good. Make indemnification. Repay. But how do you repay a life? The life is spent. The blood is spilt. And if you spill the blood of the murderer, does it bring the victim back? It gives you justice. You feel good. But does it actually bring your loved one back? Of course it doesn't. He remains dead as before. Like water that's in the ground. You can't put the water back in the bottle once it's been spilled on the ground. So in that case, what will you gain? You lost your son Amnon. Now you're losing another son Avshalom. What will you gain from that? It must be, she argued, that the death of Amnon will atone for his sin. And as far as Avshalom doing what he did, on some level, he was an agent of a higher force. And he deserved what he got. And the fact that Avshalom did what he did is not good, but not a reason to banish him. What's to be gained? Radak puts it a little different. He says, what's the point of more bloodshed? What's the point? Radak says, Yachshav HaMelech Machashaves Shelo Yidach Meno Nidach. Let the banished one not be banished. If one died, will it help you if two are dead? Will you be a happier king if one son is dead and that broke your heart? Now you can have two dead sons? That's going to make you happier? What does this have to do with eternity? Or what was the Neder B'Kodesh even thinking? So this is getting even more frustrating. But then I remembered that in the 39th chapter of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe talks about this verse in a Lurianic sense, the way the Arizal explained it. And it made sense to me. One second. Neder B'Kodesh purportedly wrote his commentary based on Drush and Sod, Kabbalah. Okay, so he must have studied the writings of the Arizal. For all I know, he was inspired by the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, which is based on Lurianic teaching. And probably this is what he means. So the Neder BaKodesh set me off in that direction. What do we find in the end of the 39th chapter of Tanya? And how does the pasuk, the verse, La Yidich Min Nidich, how does it speak to us there? The Alter Rebbe in Tanya seeks to demonstrate the importance of, and in fact the necessity of, emotional engagement in our Avodat Hashem. In other words, although Hamaisa Hu Ha'ikir, although the deed is our creed, it doesn't tell the whole story. If a person only does the right things, he walks the walk, maybe even talks the talk, but his mind and his heart are not in it, that's not really called serving Hashem. That's a problem. And the book of Tanya, as the Alter Rebbe illustrates on the very first page, on the Shaar, on the opening page, has the focused objective of explaining to you how and why it's possible, and in fact, within reach, close reach, Karev Elecha Davar Ma'od, as Moshe Rabbeinu says on the last day of his terrestrial lifetime, that this thing of this Yiddishkeit, this fulfillment of Torah, this living a life of mission, meaning, and purpose, is exceedingly close to every one of us. Beficha, we can speak it. Bilvavcha, you can feel it. And Lasai, to do it. So, okay, to do it. You can train anybody to do anything. You can train an actor to say things. You can force yourself to say things. But how about feeling? How are you supposed to feel it? I don't like that. I'm not interested in that. Don't feel it. Be excited about it. It doesn't excite me. Material pursuit, things that taste good and feel good. Now I understand. Now you're talking to me. That interests me. Learning Torah, doing mitzvahs doesn't interest me. So I'll do it. I'll bow my head in subservience. I'll follow the instructions, but my heart's not in it. Well, that's a problem. Your heart has to be in it. And Moshe Rabbeinu said to us, this is his legacy to us, that it's Karev Elecha. It's very close. It's extremely, extremely attainable. But it doesn't seem that way. So the Alter Rebbe in the book of Tanya says, I'm going to take you in that direction, but I have to warn you, it's a derech arucha uketzara. It's going to be a long way, but it's a straightforward way. The road's paved, so to speak. Famous story in the Gemara, a man who said, I was never bested until I met the sage said, I met this young Jerusalemite, and he said, which is the fast way into the city? He said, this is the short, long way, that's the long, short way. The short, long way was short geographically, but filled with impossible obstacles to scale. The long, short way was a beautifully, easily travelable road. Nicely paved, no obstacles. It was a long way, but you just keep driving. And you get straight through the front gate. This is the book of Tanya. So the Alter Rebbe talks about the concept of what we call habitual mitzvahs. I get used to doing it. No love, no awe, no emotion. So is that a problem? Let me tell you what we're all going to agree with is a problem, and then I'll tell you what the Alter Rebbe says, what else is a problem. All right, everybody's talking about this awful, disgusting, horrible story of this masquerading therapist. It's probably a Torah scholar, a monster, rapist, serial abuser, horrid individual, wicked, evil, horrid individual. So what if, because that's on everybody's mind, what if this person studied Torah, amassed Torah knowledge, with the goal of seducing innocent people with it? Just imagine. Could be such a thing. In fact, could be that's what this guy was. I don't know. Could be. Imagine a person would study Torah because he wants to take advantage of those vulnerable members of society to exploit and abuse other people. You think that Torah is holy? You think that Torah shines? I don't think so. That's not actually what I think. It says so. It says that Torah goes nowhere. It stays right here in this world of darkness. It doesn't elevate, so to speak, into the heavens. It doesn't make an impact in the highest heavens. Hashem has no nachas in that. Why? Because Torah study is supposed to bring you closer to God. It's supposed to make you more sensitive and more compassionate. You use this Torah, used God's Torah to abuse other people. Sick. I don't think anybody's going to argue with you about that. But the Rebbe comes along and he says, it's more than that. Kasher lemdim Torah, what he says, if a person learns Torah, and he's doing mitzvahs, not because he cares about God, not because relationship with God is nothing. The Rebbe says, I'm very sorry. Then the Torah goes nowhere. Now, most people would say Torah which is done with an opposite intention, with the intention to harm and to hurt, is valueless. A person who masquerades, going through the motions of putting on tefillin, affixing a mezuzah, making kiddush, keeping Shabbos, and he's doing it in order to advance his own criminal activities, for sure that's not a mitzvah, you're going to say. All the Rebbe says, if a person is only engaged in religious pursuit, not because he wants a relationship with Hashem, not because he wants to be closer to God, but because he feels that he or she has something to gain from it. He wants to be a respected person. He'll be respected if he's knowledgeable. He wants to be respected. He'll be respected if he's pious, or at least seems so. The Alter Rebbe says, "Afilu imeni esek shelei lishma mamish." Even if a person doesn't engage in Torah study for the wrong reasons, for bad reasons, lishum eze pniya, for any kind of negative, self-serving purpose, chas v'shalom. Ella, rather, like it says, like the Navi Yeshayahu in the 29th chapter of his prophecies, he laments, "V'atehi rasa ma'isi mitzvahs hanashim l'mada." The prophet laments, he says, this is like habitual mitzvahs, going through the motions. What does it mean, going through the motions? Well, the Rebbe says it means machmas hergel, because nurture became nature. That's what you're doing. That's what we do. That's what we've been doing all along. Hirgilu, v'limda, yavi, v'rabbai. This is what your parents, your teachers, that's what they taught you to do. That's what you're supposed to do. So that's what you do. So it's not like you're not doing it for something bad. You don't have a bad, baleful intent with the mitzvahs. You're not trying to masquerade as somebody you aren't in order to be able to do something which is criminal and nefarious. Imagine a person who gives tzedakah, he supports Torah institutions so that he could defraud people. It's a Ponzi scheme. I knew somebody like this. Rahman al-Tzan. He's a Ponzi scheme. He's a liar. He's a cheater. He's ruining people's lives. And he knows that he's ruining the people's lives. It's not even like innocent. There's no innocence whatsoever. But he has to look like he's a good guy. So part of the role playing that he's pious and that he's trustworthy is he gives money to tzedakah. He's at the Daf Yomi class every single morning. How could he be a bad guy? A defrauder? A Ponzi schemer? He davens at a minyan every day. He learns Daf Yomi every day. What are you talking about? He's a great guy. He does everything right, except the things he doesn't do right. Much, much worse than that. All these things he does right so he could defraud you. It's all a scheme. It's all an evil game. It's a manipulation. He abuses God. He abuses Judaism for his own selfish, mean-spirited, criminal activities. What do you think? That Torah is valuable? Think Hashem has nachas? Well, at least he's learning Torah. At least he gave tzedakah. So this is not such a bad person. He's not trying to abuse God, or abuse Judaism. He's just, his heart's not in it. He's going through the motions. Doesn't feel anything. So the Alter Rebbe says that even though factually it may be very pious, maybe going through all the motions, if his heart is not in it, he's Eini Eisik L'Shma, then it's a problem. The mitzvahs can't go anywhere. Ki L'Shma Mamish, because for the sake of God, if you're not going to fire up your emotions, it's not going to work. At least the latent emotions that we believe is there. Every one of us has it. If you don't fire that up, it's not going to work. If you don't bring it forth, you don't bring your neshama forth, forget about it. So if a person feels strongly about his or her Judaism and they come to the conclusion, I want to be a good Jew. I don't know, I just feel I want this. This is what my parents did, this is what my grandparents did. I want to do this, I want to do it well, and I want to devote myself, and I care about it, and I don't want to be distant from Hashem. I don't want to be ashamed in front of my ancestors. He's sincere about this. Alter Rebbe says that's something. It doesn't have to be a raging fire of love. It doesn't have to be an ocean of passion, but there's some kind of sincere emotional involvement. A mitzvah like that is beautiful. It's meaningful. But if a person has no feelings for God, doesn't care about God, who's God? Never heard of him. Well, what are you doing? I'm doing stuff. Are you serving God? God. How does he even get into this conversation? I don't know. You're putting on tefillin. I'm putting on tefillin because, it's a... whatever. That's what I've been doing my whole life. I'm going to stop doing it now. And what would my mother-in-law say? And what do my friends say? So I do it. That's not serving God. That's a problem. So when a person is going to do something, for example, for somebody else, if you do something for somebody else, what's your motivation? Why did you go out of your way for somebody? Why'd you buy them a birthday card? Why'd you bother reaching out to them? If you don't love or at least respect them. The answer is I wouldn't do it otherwise. I only do it because I love or respect them. Or, there is one other possibility. I don't love them. I don't respect them. I need something from them. Oh, that's a different story. Yeah, so why are you all of a sudden being nice to me? What do you need from me? Nobody likes that. Nobody appreciates being abused. Nobody appreciates being respected or being loved when it's fake. You think Hashem appreciates it then? You can't serve Hashem. It doesn't work like that. There's got to be some width, some kind of emotional involvement, some level of love, some level of respect. And he says love itself doesn't cut it, because love itself is just for I love. There has to be a level of respect also, level of awe. It has to be Ava and Yira, and these are, so to speak, the proverbial wings with which the mitzvah is able to fly. So what happens to a lot of our Yiddishkeit? A lot of mitzvahs which are done mindlessly. A lot of Torah which is studied because of one reason or the other, neither of which match what we just described. No love, no respect, no awe. In fact, not even thinking about God. What happens to all that Yiddishkeit? There's a humorous but painful story told about a yeshiva student who leaves a very famous academy of Talmudic study, and he joins a Hasidic yeshiva. And he meets his erstwhile Rosh Yeshiva, and the Rosh Yeshiva says, "Why did you leave our yeshiva? Why did you leave our yeshiva? We were learning so well. You were growing. You were gaining knowledge, length and breadth." He gives him this excuse, that excuse. Breakfast is better. He says, "Well, you never cared about breakfast." He says, "Well, I have better friends. You had wonderful friends here." Every excuse he shoots down. So finally the boy says, I'll tell you the truth. Rebbe says, in that yeshiva, they teach you how to read people's mind. And I couldn't resist that. He just says, please, that's ridiculous. The Talmud says, Ein Adam Yodea Masha B'libo Shachavera. Nobody knows what's really in somebody else's heart. He says, you know what's in somebody's heart? He says, yeah, I do. Rosh Hashiva says, okay. I'm gonna close my eyes now for 30 seconds. And you tell me what I was thinking. So the Rosh Hashiva closes his eyes. 30 long seconds go by. He opens his eyes and he says to the boy, so what was I thinking? And without batting an eyelash, the yeshiva student says to his former teacher, he says, you were thinking about God. The Rosh Hashiva says, I could swear in a Sefer Torah, I wasn't thinking about God for 1 nanosecond. The boy said, I know. That's why I left your yeshiva. Painful story. It's possible for a person to study God's Torah without thinking about God. Intellectual pursuit. It's fascinating stuff. I want to be literate. I want to know about my history. I want to know about Jewish jurisprudence. I want to know what fired up the minds and hearts, the imaginations of great people in the past. I want to study. And it's fascinating, intriguing, interesting, uplifting. Did you mention spiritual? Did you mention God? Do you know that the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed? It says, they didn't make a blessing on the Torah. That's why the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed. A blessing on the Torah, it's not a biblical commandment. It's not even a rabbinic commandment. It's a prayer we do. So he didn't make a blessing on the Torah. That's not the meaning. They studied Torah, but not with a sense of awe and reverence. It wasn't God's Torah. It was a cultural curio, an academic, secular pursuit. That is the greatest offense. That's the greatest turning of one's back against Hashem. What happens to so much Yiddishkeit, which gets done in a mindless way? What happens to mitzvahs, which are done with far less than good intentions? Alter Rebbe says, when a person is engaged in Yiddishkeit without the right reasons, for some kind of personal, selfish gain, wants glory, honor, he's going to be respected by his peers. Wants to be a Talmud Chacham, wants everybody to call him rabbi. You know how many fake rabbis there are out there? People who love the title rabbi, ignoramuses who don't know from an aleph to a beis. They're everywhere. What do they do it for? What do you want to be called rabbi for? It's funny, everybody gives you medical opinions today. All the experts are on Facebook. But they don't call themselves doctor. You say, are you a doctor? They say, no, I'm not a doctor, but I'm just a smart guy. But everybody wants to be a rabbi. Another one of my pet peeves. Why do they want to be called rabbi for? To be respected. Who doesn't want to be respected? I'm Jewish. I'm living in a Jewish milieu. I want to be respected. They imagine, they think that rabbis are respected. I'm not so sure it's true, but that's what they imagine. So what if a person learns Torah for that reason? So the Alter Rebbe says, Hazai oisei pniya shemitzad klipa. That comes from klipa. Klipa is the husk. It's extraneous. It's not what God's purpose was. And therefore, it embodies, it's what embodies, what frames the Torah study. And the Torah is like an exile. This is a little scary. So what happens to all that Torah? What happens to all those mitzvahs? Okay, I'm not saying that most of us are involved in some kind of criminal activity using a Yiddishkeit camouflage as a cover. I'm not saying that you're coming to a Torah class or involved in a minyan because you're trying to gain the trust of investors when you intend to defraud them. I'm not saying that. I'm not suggesting that there are a dime a dozen abusers who walk around gaining Torah knowledge so that they can exploit vulnerable people. Chas v'sholom. There are such sick, demented, horrible individuals, but it's very rare. But there are a lot of people who are doing things mindlessly or to please somebody else. A lot of people. Can I say most? Or most of us? Most of the time? So what are we doing it for? If it's actually pointless. The Rebbe says, it's true that that Torah study is framed with the klipa. It's stuck in a husk. It's true. But it's temporary. It's temporary. It's only lefisha. Ad asher yasa tshuva. When you do tshuva, the Gemara in Yuma tells us on page 86 that tshuva mevia refuah l'olam, that tshuva brings healing to this world. And healing, then a mystical level, means that a sin is like something which is sick, diseased, a diseased kind of life, separated from a healthy, normative source. And when we behave that way, what happens is that we lose our connection. But the good news is that we can regenerate life. Tshuva brings healing. This is why our rabbis told us in the Gemara Masechet Pesachim on page 50, a person should do the right thing, even if it's not for the right reasons, because because out of doing it for the wrong reasons, eventually we do it for the right reasons. And here the Alter Rebbe says something absolutely unbelievable. Shebevadai, that it is certain. Soifei lases tshuva, that in the end everybody will do tshuva. And if not in this lifetime, in a future lifetime. Begilgul zeh, or begilgul acher, in this iteration, in this incarnation, or in a future incarnation. How are we so sure? Ki lo yidach mimenu nidach. Because, in the words that are found in Shmuel Beis, because the banished one shall not ever remain imbanished. The literal level of that pasuk doesn't speak to us in Shaar HaBitachon. But in the way Reb Chaim Vital explains it in Shaar HaPsukim, which putatively is what the Neder HaKodesh has in mind, because he writes a commentary which is based on Kabbalah. Reb Chaim Vital taught in the name of the Arizal that it means, and I quote, Kichol haneshameis shebeguf yutuknu. All bodies, all souls that are embodied in the end will be rectified, will be fixed. Terem bayagula, before Mashiach comes. Va'afilu ezen nitzutz kedusha muetes, even a tiny spark of holiness, every neshama will be fixed, every neshama will be made whole, every neshama will come home. And that means not only every neshama, but every ounce of holiness. Because as the Rebbe says in L'Kutei Sichos, Chilek Daled in Parshas Kairach, that even when the mitzvah is filled or laden or surrounded or buried in garbage, in horrific stuff, there's still a spark of holiness there. There's still a mitzvah there. It has to be redeemed. It has to be cleansed. It has to be refined. It has to be extracted and elevated. And what happens to a really horrible person? Somebody else, a tzaddik, will come along later. A different iteration of that neshama will take those diamonds from the cesspool and clean them. And maybe it's hardened, and maybe it's petrified, and they'll find a way of chipping all the garbage and this disgusting, horrible stuff off, and he'll be able to redeem the light. By the way, that's the other meaning of the word tikkun olam that people love to talk about. You understand what's going on over here? By the way, this thing is brought in the name of Chachmei HaKabbalah in Hilchos Talmud Torah. In the 4th chapter, Halacha Gimel, the Alter Rebbe quotes it from Chachmei HaKabbalah in Halacha. In Halacha, no less. He says, what should be with a person who's learning Torah for the wrong reasons? The Alter Rebbe says, let him learn Torah. Because in the end, every kind of good activity will be made good again. Its goodness will be revealed. It'll be extrapolated, it'll be extracted from its darkness, It'll be pulled out of the black hole and it'll be returned to its source. They say that Hasidim used to verbring about this Perek of Tanya. They used to say, imagine, they used to say, how we have to look at life. How a single act of tshuva, how a sense of yearning and recommitment and rejuvenation can actually be affecting things we did years ago, decades ago, even things that were done by others who shared the same root soul as us from previous incarnations. And all of it can be elevated through tshuva. You see what it means to make a Baal tshuva, to become a Baal tshuva? It's huge. So I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking, maybe this is what Rabbeinu Bachaya is talking about. Maybe this is what Rabbeinu Bachaya says, if we can't trust, if we don't, we're not aware that at every moment, that even if I do a mitzvah for the wrong reasons, I have to believe in eternity. And I have to believe in the eternity of a mitzvah. And I have to believe that Olam Haba, which represents the essence, the goodness of that mitzvah, that it will be redeemed. Because most of the time, I'm not so mindful. I don't know about you, I'm not so mindful. I'm ashamed to tell you that I'm not doing things lishma, for the sake of Hashem. And there's all kinds of other reasons that we might have. All kinds of other selfish, personal reasons that might motivate us to do the right thing. So we're not doing the right thing for the right reasons. And if that case, what's happening? What's the value of it? This can bring you down. Rabbeinu Bachaya says you have to know that when it comes to Olam Haba, first of all, that you have to trust in Hashem. You have to put your trust. Your trust is Hagmul Haroi. You have to know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu recompenses, that in the end, a mitzvah is a mitzvah, that in the end, everything has its value, and whatever value it has, it will equal that value. It's a lame metaphor. Imagine a person is working, and he's getting paid currency, but he knows that this currency is being phased out. And the money he's getting is going to be worthless. It's worthless currency. So he's like, what am I working for? And then he's promised that in the end, somebody will come along, all the old currency will be bought. Don't you worry about it. You can't get your money out now, but eventually you will be able to get it. It's going in a bank account. It's a cryptocurrency. Eventually it's redeemable. Don't give up. Keep toiling, keep working. The Gemara said, why did the Gemara in Pesachim have to tell you? If it was such a simple thing, if everybody's doing the right thing, why did the Gemara have to come along and say, oh, by the way, you should know, you must do the right thing even if you're doing it for the wrong reasons, because in the end, it'll work out. Our rabbis told us because that's the matter of fact. Rabbeinu Bachaya has to address this because it's a reality we have to deal with. You have to have Bitachon. Bitachon in leyidach menu nidach. Bitachon in the eternity. Bitachon in the idea that ultimately deep down every one of us loves Hashem, and that love is chelki Hashem amra nafshi. In the end, we're really, without even knowing it, motivated by the drive for a deeper relationship. Think about this. The word mitoich can be understood as out of. Out of. On a literal level, it means that from doing the right thing for the wrong reason, eventually you will come to do the right thing for the right reason. So, you'll come to learn Torah. You learn Torah. In the words of the Gemara elsewhere, Hamor Shaba Machazir Lemutav. It's a Gemara, it's a Medrash Echarabba. In the end, there's a luminary, there's a brilliance in Torah, a light in Torah. It'll pull you along. It'll spirit you along. It'll uplift you in the end. In other words, that there's this business of just keep doing the right thing. Keep doing the right thing, because in the end, you'll do the right thing for the right reasons. But there's a deeper meaning to this. And the deeper meaning is that even though right now you're doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, or so you think. You think you're doing this because of what he or she or they will say. That's why you think you're doing it. But deep down, Mitoich, if you go really, really, really digging under all those external levels of consciousness, at the core, mitoich, inside the shalei lishma, lishma. Ultimately, every yid yearns to be close to Hashem. We may not be aware of it, but it is a latent truth. And because it's a latent truth, tshuva is like shatters all these barriers, all these things which get in the way, it just shatters them. And when it shatters it, suddenly your path is clear. And you have to not only believe this, because you can believe in all kinds of things, it doesn't change the way you live. You have to live with it. You have to have bitachon in it. You have to trust in it. And not only you have to trust and have bitachon, then in the end, you will get, the mitzvah will be, its value it can be redeemed in the end. It's not going to be lost. Rabbeinu Bachaya goes further and he says there's another level, and that's the concept. Not only is what the mitzvah is worth, but then there's michesed habayri yasala. So I want to suggest that the first thing is talking about Gan Eden. He's talking about, the Garden of Eden, so to speak, the paradise where neshamas go, the afterlife. But there's another afterlife here. And the Neder B'Kodesh says, this afterlife, the chesed, that's ayin le'rasa. That no eye has seen. The Rebbe says, in a Maimer, Lahavin in Tchias HaMesim, the Rebbe says that the meaning of the word of the Gemara in Brachas, Kol Hanavim Kululei Nisnabu El Yemesa Mashiach, Avala Oilam Haba Ayin Le'rasa. All the prophets spoke about the coming of Mashiach, the Messianic era, but not the era of resurrection. That this is referring to the deepest levels of divine revelation and of experiences that will only become part of our life after that period of the resurrection, which is far beyond the mitzvahs that we actually do. So why does he talk about Chasidim and Nevi'im? Let's say something wild. When Mashiach will come, when we go past the era of Mashiach, we will all be Chasidim. And we'll all be Nevi'im. It says when Mashiach comes, Kulam Yedu Eisi, we'll all know God. It says, Ayin ba'ayin yiru, we're all going to see God. We're all going to hear the voice of God. This is our ultimate destiny. We will all be prophets someday. We will all be super pious someday. And we have to know that that's inherently a part of us. The Alter Rebbe, in the 14th chapter of Tanya, speaks about the promise that we make to Hashem, that we're forced, so to speak, to make to Hashem, Tihi Tzaddik. An oath is administered to every neshama. The Gemara in Nida says, be righteous. V'al tihi rasha, don't be wicked. Now, the Rebbe explains in detail what does it mean, the level of a tzaddik, what does it mean, a rasha. And then he says, in case you can't become a tzaddik, which means really like to break the atmosphere of your Yetzer Hara, to be able to become weightless and freed of the things that weigh us down. He says, because most people can't attain the level of tihi tzaddik, so that's why you say, at least al tihi rasha. Don't openly or overtly violate the will of Hashem. Fight the good fight and vanquish the Yetzer Hara continuously. So then why do we get these oath be a tzaddik? So the Alter Rebbe says, because if you strive for this kind of holiness, maybe maybe there'll be like a spark of a tzaddik can like impregnate itself in you. Maybe we can be connected to the neshama of a tzaddik. And as the Kabbalist taught us, we recognize tzaddikim because there's a part of us that recognizes innately a tzaddik. We know what it is. And then v'amech kulam tzaddik in the Mishnah says we're all potentially capable of relating to this loftier reality. You have to trust in that too. When you trust in that too, life is different. Life is different because you realize the value that's attached to every single moment of life. That even if my devotion is delinquent and deficient, if I'm doing what Hashem told me to do, I have to trust that the sparks will all come home. And have to believe that in the end, we will reach the greatest levels, the greatest heights. The truth is that I prepared another whole thing. had a mimer from the Alter Rebbe in Torah, and from the Tzemach Tzedek in Derech Mitzvah Secha, and a mimer from the Rebbe Rashab from Materes, and from the Friedrich Rebbe from Tafshin, to develop this whole idea of the different levels of Sha'ar. How the level of Sha'ar, level of reward in Gan Eden, is the mitzvahs as we relate or understand them, which is filtered through the prism of Torah. That the level of the coming of the resurrection means that we're able to relate to the mitzvah itself, and ultimately, how the Rebbe explains in the Maimer, that takes us beyond all of this. And we're out of time, so whatever. There's a lot more. When the Melech used to read the Torah to the Jewish people at Hakel, every 7 years they would gather all the Jewish people together in the Beis HaMikdash, and it was like to recreate the scene of an inspiring scene, an uplifting scene that would be reminiscent of Sinai. So the king would read from a Torah scroll, and then he would say, "Yes, there's much more written here. Much more than I read. There's much more than I read here, my friends." But this is the gist, at least, a kernel of my humble suggestion of maybe this is what Rabbeinu Bachaya is saying, and that's why it's so important for us to have this trust, and to have this certainty, because it changes the way we actually live our lives today. Maybe there'll be a chance yet to make up, to share the other things that I prepared. I hope that this has opened your eyes. It certainly opened my eyes, transformed my view of many things, including the Pshat in this holy book. I hope it's uplifted you. I hope that it's going to make you a better Yid. I hope that together we will serve Hashem with ever-increasing vigor and emotion and devotion, and that as a result, we should be Zoiche to become Chasidim and Nevi'im with the coming of Mashiach b'mheira u'b'yameinu amen. Thanks so much for joining. If you liked, so like, share. If you haven't yet, subscribe, youtube.com/Rabbi Mendel Kaplan. And I look forward to seeing you in the future and sharing words of Hashem's holy Torah together. Have a beautiful day. And again, thank you so much for joining. Kol Tov.